It started with a sentence no one expected to hear from the future king's eldest son. Behind closed palace doors, Prince George reportedly made a declaration so firm, so emotionally charged, that even senior royal aides were left stunned into silence. What began as a quiet disagreement over royal inheritance quickly spiraled into a crisis touching the crown itself, and Camilla's most guarded collection of jewels was suddenly at the center of it all. At first, insiders believed the moment would remain buried inside Kensington Palace, hidden beneath the same layers of silence that have protected royal tensions for generations. But something about George's reaction reportedly changed the atmosphere entirely. According to whispers now circulating among palace staff, the young prince did not hesitate when discussions turned toward the future inheritance of certain royal jewels personally selected and preserved by Camilla. What shocked those present was not simply the refusal itself, but the intensity behind it. Sources claim George's words carried emotion far beyond his years, as though he understood the symbolic weight those jewels represented inside a monarchy still haunted by its past. The discussion reportedly began during what aides assumed would be a routine private conversation involving long-term royal planning. William and Catherine were allegedly present when George first learned more detailed information about how specific heirlooms might eventually pass through future generations of the family. At first, the tone remained calm, measured, almost procedural. But insiders now suggest the atmosphere shifted the moment George questioned why certain pieces connected to Camilla appeared to be receiving special significance while the emotional legacy of Princess Diana remained surrounded by careful silence. That was the moment, according to multiple whispers from within palace circles, when the future king's eldest son reportedly drew a line that no one expected him to draw so openly. What followed allegedly left even senior courtiers deeply unsettled. George reportedly declared that he would never wear or inherit jewels that he believed represented pain, division, or rewritten history within the royal family. The word spread quickly through private royal corridors, carried in hushed tones between aides who immediately understood the danger such a statement posed. Because this was never simply about jewels. Inside the monarchy, royal heirlooms are symbols of continuity, loyalty, and acceptance of the institution itself. Refusing them, especially at such a young age, was viewed by some insiders as an emotional rebellion against the carefully managed narrative surrounding Camilla's role within the royal family. William and Catherine were reportedly caught completely off guard by the strength of George's stance. Sources claim William initially attempted to calm the situation quietly, understanding how explosive the implications could become if the disagreement ever escaped palace walls. Catherine, meanwhile, was said to be visibly emotional during the exchange, particularly after George allegedly referenced Diana in a deeply personal way. Though exact words remain hidden behind layers of royal secrecy, insiders insist George questioned whether future generations were being asked to forget emotional truths the public never truly forgot themselves. And suddenly, what began as a private inheritance discussion transformed into something much larger, something tied to memory, loyalty, and the invisible scars still running through the House of Windsor. Senior courtiers reportedly moved quickly to contain the whispers before they reached the press. Staff were allegedly warned not to discuss the incident outside tightly controlled internal circles. But by then, the emotional damage had already begun spreading quietly through the palace. Some aides reportedly viewed George's stance as courageous. Others feared it revealed dangerous fractures forming inside the monarchy's next generation. Because if the future heir to the throne was already questioning symbolic royal traditions tied to Camilla, what would that mean for the future stability of the crown itself? And perhaps even more unsettling was the growing realization that George's refusal may not have come from youthful defiance at all, but from a deeper emotional understanding shaped by stories, memories, and truths passed down far more carefully than the palace ever imagined. But what shocked the palace even more than George's refusal was the hidden reason behind it, a reason tied to old wounds the monarchy thought had long disappeared forever. For years, certain royal jewels remained hidden from public attention, carefully protected behind layers of protocol and silence. Yet insiders now claim Camilla had been privately organizing which pieces would one day pass to future generations. What seemed like harmless preparation suddenly became explosive the moment Prince George openly rejected the arrangement, and questions about loyalty, legacy, and memory erupted across the royal household. In the days following George's reported refusal, palace corridors allegedly became consumed by whispers that stretched far beyond a simple disagreement over inheritance. What had once been treated as routine royal planning was now being viewed through an entirely different lens. According to insiders, Camilla had spent years quietly reviewing the future placement of certain heirlooms tied to the crown, carefully deciding which pieces would remain connected to senior members of the royal family long after the current reign ended. To outsiders, such preparations may have appeared ordinary. But inside the monarchy, every jewel carries emotional weight, hidden history, and symbolic power capable of reigniting wounds many believed had finally faded with time. Sources now claim some of the pieces at the center of the controversy carry an especially sensitive meaning within royal circles. Certain jewels were allegedly associated with moments that remained deeply painful for supporters of Princess Diana, while others were believed to symbolize Camilla's gradual rise into the heart of the institution despite years of public resistance. That emotional tension reportedly became impossible to ignore once George learned more detailed information about how those heirlooms might eventually be passed down. Insiders suggest the young prince began questioning why discussions surrounding future royal legacy appeared to focus so heavily on preserving one narrative while carefully avoiding another. And for those present during the conversations, the emotional shift was immediate. Royal historians, former aides, and long-standing palace observers were reportedly divided behind closed doors. Some believed the monarchy had every right to modernize its traditions and establish new lines of continuity under King Charles and Camilla. Others allegedly feared that sidelining the emotional symbolism connected to Diana could create a dangerous fracture between the institution and the public memory that still surrounds her decades later. Because despite years of carefully controlled royal messaging, Diana's influence never truly disappeared. It remained alive in public affection, in William's protectiveness toward her legacy, and now, according to insiders, within George himself. The deeper these discussions became, the more some palace officials reportedly realized this was not simply a generational disagreement. It was the return of unresolved emotional conflict that the monarchy had spent years trying to bury beneath ceremony and silence. Whispers soon emerged claiming Diana's legacy had been noticeably absent from certain private inheritance discussions altogether. Whether intentional or not, that alleged exclusion reportedly disturbed George more deeply than palace aides initially understood. Sources claim he began seeing the jewels not merely as treasures, but as symbols of competing histories within his own family, one representing institutional continuity, the other representing emotional truth, sacrifice, and unresolved heartbreak. Suddenly, George's refusal no longer appeared impulsive. To some insiders, it looked deliberate, personal, even deeply principled. And as those whispers spread quietly through royal staff circles, the atmosphere inside the palace allegedly shifted overnight. Conversations became cautious. Loyalties became harder to read. Even senior aides reportedly sensed that something far more dangerous than a family disagreement had begun unfolding behind closed doors. William and Catherine were said to be especially shaken by how quickly the situation escalated emotionally. Sources suggest they initially believed the matter could be resolved privately through calm discussions and careful reassurance. But the more George reportedly explained his feelings, the more difficult it became to dismiss his concerns as youthful emotion. Palace staff allegedly noticed a growing tension surrounding any conversation involving inheritance, symbolism, or Diana's place within the monarchy's future. Because beneath every carefully chosen royal statement now lingered a frightening possibility that the next generation of heirs might no longer quietly accept traditions built upon emotional silence. And while the palace struggled to contain the fallout, another conversation was already unfolding behind William and Catherine's closed doors, and it would change everything. As tensions quietly spread through royal corridors, Prince William and Catherine reportedly entered a series of deeply emotional private meetings focused entirely on George's future. Sources now claim the couple understood immediately that this was no childish refusal, it was a defining moment. And the deeper George explained his feelings, the clearer it became that this dispute was about far more than jewels. According to insiders, the atmosphere inside Kensington Palace changed dramatically after the inheritance controversy erupted behind closed doors. Conversations reportedly became longer, heavier, and far more personal than anyone expected. William and Catherine were no longer simply responding to a disagreement over royal protocol. They were confronting something much more dangerous, an emotional awakening inside the next generation of the monarchy, one tied directly to the unresolved pain that has shadowed the royal family for decades. Sources claim William was placed in an almost impossible position. On one side stood royal duty, tradition, and the expectation that future heirs quietly accept the institution's carefully managed narrative without resistance. On the other stood his eldest son, speaking with an honesty that reportedly reminded William of his own private frustrations during his younger years. Insiders now suggest William understood better than anyone else the emotional burden George was carrying. Because beneath the headlines and palace whispers was a painful reality the monarchy rarely acknowledges publicly. Children born into the crown inherit not only privilege but generations of silence, conflict, and emotional compromise. And for William, that realization allegedly struck harder than palace aides initially understood. Catherine, meanwhile, reportedly became George's strongest emotional protector throughout the growing crisis. Sources claim she encouraged him to express his feelings openly even as senior palace figures quietly pushed for the situation to be softened, controlled, or quietly forgotten altogether. Insiders describe Catherine as deeply aware of the emotional consequences that can emerge when royal children are taught too early to suppress personal truth for the sake of public stability. And according to whispers from within royal circles, she reportedly feared that forcing George into silence could leave scars far deeper than the controversy itself. That quiet determination allegedly created tension with certain senior aides who viewed the entire situation as increasingly dangerous for the monarchy's image. Behind closed doors, concerns reportedly intensified about how the story could damage perceptions of unity within the royal household. Palace officials allegedly feared the growing whispers surrounding George's refusal were beginning to mirror painful moments from the monarchy's past, moments involving emotional isolation, divided loyalties, and public fractures that once pushed the institution into crisis. Some aides reportedly worried comparisons to Diana and Charles would become unavoidable if the story ever reached the public in full detail. Others feared something even more unsettling, that George's stance could resonate deeply with a public still emotionally connected to Diana's memory decades later. Because the more insiders quietly discussed the situation, the more they realized George's concerns were not rooted in rebellion, but in discomfort over what he allegedly saw as an attempt to reshape royal memory itself. Sources claim George expressed unease about traditions that seemed to celebrate certain parts of royal history while carefully distancing others into silence. That discomfort reportedly struck William on a profoundly personal level. Insiders now suggest the Prince of Wales became increasingly protective of Diana's legacy as tensions escalated, particularly after hearing George speak about emotional honesty, memory, and the importance of preserving truth within the monarchy's future. Suddenly, this was no longer about inheritance plans or ceremonial heirlooms. It became a battle over identity, over which stories future generations of royals would be expected to carry forward, and which stories they would quietly be asked to forget. And as those emotional divisions deepened behind palace walls, the pressure surrounding William and Catherine reportedly became almost unbearable. But while William and Catherine tried to shield George from mounting pressure, insiders claim Camilla herself was already reacting behind the scenes. At first, the palace expected the controversy to fade quietly. Instead, insiders claim Camilla reacted with visible frustration as whispers surrounding George's declaration intensified. Courtiers reportedly watched tensions rise during private gatherings, where every glance and carefully chosen word suddenly carried enormous weight. And for the first time in years, old divisions inside the monarchy allegedly began resurfacing in dangerous ways. What palace officials initially dismissed as a temporary emotional disagreement had now evolved into something far more unpredictable. According to insiders, the atmosphere surrounding Camilla shifted almost overnight as reports of George's refusal continued circulating through private royal circles. Staff members allegedly noticed growing tension during internal meetings, where discussions once focused on ceremonial duties suddenly became consumed by concern over loyalty, perception, and the fragile balance holding the royal household together. Sources now claim Camilla viewed George's stance as deeply personal, not merely because of the rejection itself, but because of what it symbolized. For years, she had reportedly worked carefully to strengthen her place within the institution, slowly transforming public hostility into measured acceptance through patience, discipline, and unwavering loyalty to the crown. But insiders suggest George's refusal threatened to reopen emotional wounds the monarchy had spent decades trying to stabilize. Because if the future generation of heirs openly questioned symbols connected to her legacy, what did that mean for the permanence of her place in royal history? That question reportedly began haunting conversations behind closed palace doors. Private dinners inside royal residences allegedly became increasingly tense as the controversy deepened. According to whispers from staff, conversations grew unusually cautious whenever George, inheritance, or Diana's legacy entered the room. Some insiders claim moments of uncomfortable silence reportedly replaced the polished ease that normally defines royal gatherings. Every word suddenly seemed loaded with hidden meaning. Every gesture carried emotional weight. Even routine family interactions allegedly became strained under the pressure of unresolved feelings that had quietly resurfaced after years of suppression. And for many longtime aides, the emotional atmosphere felt disturbingly familiar. Senior palace officials were reportedly divided over how the situation should be handled moving forward. Some believed George needed to be protected and allowed space to express concerns honestly, particularly given the emotional complexity surrounding royal inheritance and Diana's enduring public memory. Others allegedly feared allowing his stance to gain attention would create dangerous instability for the monarchy's future image. According to insiders, several aides privately warned that if the story ever leaked publicly, sympathy would overwhelmingly fall on George's side, not because of politics or royal protocol, but because the public still sees echoes of Diana whenever emotional honesty collides with institutional silence inside the House of Windsor. That possibility reportedly alarmed certain palace figures more than they were willing to admit openly. Comparisons between George and a younger William allegedly began surfacing quietly among courtiers who remembered the emotional fractures of the past all too well. Sources claim some aides were unsettled by the similarities, the sense of a future heir struggling internally against expectations that demanded emotional restraint at the cost of personal truth. For William, those comparisons reportedly carried painful emotional weight. But for Camilla, insiders suggest they represented something even more dangerous: the possibility that decades of careful rehabilitation could once again become overshadowed by unresolved public attachment to Diana's legacy. As whispers intensified, reports began emerging that Camilla grew increasingly concerned about long-term damage to how history would remember her role within the monarchy. According to insiders, she understood better than anyone how fragile royal image can become once emotional narratives take hold publicly. And now, with George's declaration quietly spreading through palace corridors, fears reportedly grew that the next generation of royals might no longer protect the same carefully controlled storylines previous generations fought so hard to maintain. What began as a private inheritance dispute had transformed into an emotional reckoning capable of reshaping relationships inside the royal family itself. But the greatest shock was still to come because George's declaration was about to inspire unexpected support from within the royal family itself. What began as a private family disagreement soon evolved into something far more dangerous for the monarchy. Behind palace walls, subtle alliances reportedly started forming. Certain royals remained silent. Others quietly signaled support for George's stance. And as insiders watched the divisions deepen, fears grew that the crown was entering another emotionally charged battle over identity, loyalty, and the memory of Princess Diana. According to sources close to royal circles, the emotional tension surrounding George's declaration no longer belonged solely to William, Catherine, and Camilla. It had now spread quietly through the wider family, creating an atmosphere where every silence carried meaning and every private interaction sparked fresh speculation among palace aides. What alarmed senior officials most was not open confrontation, but the subtle shift in loyalty beginning to emerge behind closed doors. Because inside the monarchy, people rarely reveal their positions publicly. Support is often communicated through guarded conversations, careful gestures, and strategic silence. And insiders claim that silence was beginning to speak volumes. Certain senior royals were reportedly more sympathetic toward George's feelings than palace officials initially expected. While few were willing to challenge royal protocol openly, sources suggest some family members privately understood why the young prince reacted so strongly after learning details surrounding the jewels and their symbolic significance. According to whispers circulating within royal residences, several figures close to the family quietly acknowledged that Diana's emotional legacy remains impossible to erase, no matter how carefully the institution attempts to modernize its public narrative. That realization allegedly created unease among aides determined to preserve stability at all costs. Because once emotional loyalty begins outweighing institutional loyalty inside the royal household, fractures become much harder to contain. At the same time, younger members of the royal family were reportedly beginning to question traditions that older generations long treated as untouchable. Sources claim George's refusal unexpectedly opened deeper conversations about inheritance, symbolism, and whether future heirs should be expected to accept every aspect of royal history without question. Some insiders allegedly described a growing generational divide inside the monarchy itself. Older courtiers viewed tradition as sacred and essential to survival. Younger voices, however, reportedly believed emotional honesty could no longer be sacrificed simply to maintain appearances. And in the center of that growing divide stood Catherine, who insiders now describe as George's most determined emotional protector. According to palace whispers, Catherine became increasingly focused on shielding George from the emotional pressure building around him. Sources claim she understood how quickly royal institutions can isolate individuals once public image becomes threatened. Rather than pressuring George into silence, insiders suggest she encouraged him to remain grounded in his feelings despite growing concern from senior aides. That quiet support reportedly strengthened George's resolve even further, creating new anxiety among officials desperate to restore calm before the situation spiraled beyond private control. But by then, the whispers had already begun escaping palace walls. Royal aides allegedly struggled desperately to stop information from reaching media insiders as rumors surrounding George's stance spread internationally online. What began as isolated palace whispers soon transformed into global fascination. Across social platforms and royal discussion circles, speculation exploded over what could have triggered such a deeply emotional reaction from the future king's eldest son. Public interest intensified because many observers believed the controversy represented something larger than a family disagreement. To them, it symbolized the continuing emotional shadow Diana still casts over the monarchy decades after her death. And according to insiders, that realization deeply unsettled parts of the institution because despite years of transition, modern branding, and carefully managed public relations, Diana's influence over younger generations of royals allegedly remains far